Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Welcome. My name is Michelle Lambert. I'm a researcher on the policy team at the Carbon Leadership Forum. And today we are hosting a webinar on our recently published report of the Northeast United States and Canada Embodied Carbon Policy Case Studies. You can find the full report, if you haven't seen it already, on our website under our Policy Resources tab. And the report includes links to all of the policies that you're going to hear about and the municipal websites and lots more detail. So hopefully you'll find the report and read that at some point as well. So I'm going to introduce Megan Byrne, who is the communications lead at CLF, just to go through our housekeeping details around Q&A, and then we'll jump in.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. My name is Megan. I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead. And for today, we are going to be using the Q&A function. So for any questions, please feel free to put that in there. That way, Michelle and the other presenters can answer them as we go, and we can collect them for the Q&A at the end. For any sort of technical issues, sharing resources, conversations, leave that in the chat. And if at any time there's any sort of technical difficulties, I'm going to put my email in there. I'll be checking that. So shoot me an email if anything wonky is happening with Zoom, and I can help out. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Megan. All right, so today you are going to hear a brief overview of each of the 9 policies that were included in the report in order to really get a sense of the breadth of policy types that can address embodied carbon in the built environment. So we will go through all of the presentations, and at the end we'll have the Q&A period to answer any questions that come up. And we're really fortunate today to have many speakers that were directly involved with the creation or the advocacy for these policies, or are now involved in the implementation phase. So you can see our very packed agenda on the slide. And I have asked the speakers just to introduce themselves when they speak about the policy that they're presenting today, so that we can get into it. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce the Carbon Leadership Forum and our work. The mission of the Carbon Leadership Forum is to eliminate the embodied carbon of buildings, materials, and infrastructure to create a just and thriving future. We do that in a number of different ways. We do research, we provide education, and we facilitate community building across 3 main areas that you see: improving data and methods, informing effective and just policy, which we'll be talking about today, and building community for impact. And the volunteer hubs or chapters that many of you I know are involved with are a key piece of that, building community impact within our regions. If anyone is still new to the topic of embodied carbon, I just wanted to really briefly put this graphic up on the screen and mention that embodied carbon is defined as what is included, the greenhouse gas emissions generated by manufacturing, the transportation, the installation, maintenance, and finally disposal of construction materials that are used in our buildings, our roads, and other infrastructure. So in the graphic, everything that you see in yellow comprises the embodied carbon, whereas the blue represents the operational carbon from the use phase. And it's really critical that we address embodied carbon now, because the emissions released early now, the embodied carbon of those materials, are more critical than the emissions released later, because as everyone knows, we have a limited time remaining before the tipping point of our climate crisis. So it's important that we address embodied carbon now, and policy is a lever for us to be able to scale that impact. So in the area of policy, our CLF team does several things. We provide direct technical guidance in the form of trainings and workshops or reviewing bill language. We conduct policy research, and we publish reports and resources like this one. All of the resources that we publish are always free and available on our website. And these are just some examples of policy-related publications that we have recently published. And then our team is also involved with standards development. So policies that address embodied carbon are being proposed and adopted at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, at a rapidly accelerating pace. The Northeast US and Canada case study report was published in March of this year, just last month, and it's a compilation of 9 of these policy case studies, which showcase the range of options that are available for governments to address embodied carbon. And the precursor to this report was the Pacific Coast Collaborative Embodied Carbon Policy Case Studies, which CLF published last year, with a similar collection of policies on the West Coast. So each of the case studies in the report explores the policy's development process, the stakeholders that were engaged, any challenges that were faced along the way, and the keys to successful adoption. And the case studies were created by interviewing many of the people involved in their successes. In addition to the case studies that you'll find in the report, these policy action maps are also included, and they provide an even broader view of the policies and programs that were passed in all of the states that you see on these maps. So we chose to highlight 9 of them, but there are many other policies in the Northeast region that have been passed. And in the report, each of these policies, those links that you see are directly linked to those municipal websites and other links for more information. So there's lots of great information in there. And then in addition, the CLF website has a global policy tracker map where we include policies that are also proposed and not just the ones that have passed. So we also track all the policies that have been proposed across the globe. So at CLF, we group embodied carbon policies into these 5 categories, and the key in the upper right is included on all of those maps in the report so that you can immediately see which type of policy it is. So just very briefly, planned actions include things like climate action plans, government pledges, executive orders, or other government commitments. And including embodied carbon targets in climate action plans is a key foundation to developing further policies. And you're going to hear today about several policies in which the climate action plan laid that groundwork. Government procurement includes green purchasing programs, which are very often referred to as Buy Clean. And these policies aim to leverage the purchasing power of public agencies, often with a goal of helping to create a market for lower carbon options in the construction materials market. Zoning and permitting is the third category, and those policies include things like land use regulations or permitting incentive programs. Decisions made in these really early development phases have a potential for a significant and long-term impact. The fifth category is building codes and bylaws. These can establish prescriptive or performance-based paths to reducing embodied carbon of specific construction materials or whole buildings. Embodied carbon has really largely been excluded from building codes up until the last couple of years, but even a relatively small embodied carbon reduction requirement in a building code can result overall in really big reductions because codes have such widespread reach, and they also send a really clear market signal. And then the last category is the deconstruction and reuse policies, which aim to extend the life of a building or materials and avoid the embodied carbon emissions associated with those materials. So we are going to hear about policies in all of these 5 categories today. And we are going to start off with zoning and permitting and with Boston's Mass Timber Accelerator Program. And I will hand the floor over to John Dalzell with the City of Boston.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you all at CLF for all the good work you're continuing to do and the opportunity to learn today from others. So thank you. I'm John Dalzell. I'm Senior Architect for Sustainable Development at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. We're the City of Boston's planning economic development agency, and we regulate large development projects in the city in particular. Projects over 50,000 square feet and 20,000 square feet come under our direct review procedure. So it's an interesting place to be doing our kind of work, real wonderful impacting opportunities. Let me go back a little bit and just give the quick narrative of our work here. And simply builds off of Boston's commitment. You want to do the next slide? Boston's commitment to being carbon neutral by 2050. And as part of that, we launched a zero net carbon building zoning initiative. And this was to set in place policy that would elevate our current green building standards to now include a full accounting of building operational carbon emissions. As we pulled that initiative together, we launched several technical advisory groups. And fortunately for me, folks like Michelle Lambert raised their hand and then promptly started calling me and saying, hey, John, you can't look at operational carbon without considering embodied carbon. And so recognizing the wisdom of my peers and folks like Michelle, we added an additional technical advisory group to focus on embodied carbon. And we tapped into the expertise at the CLF hub and brought together a very large group of national and regional experts to help us craft policy on how to bring forward embodied carbon into our regulatory space. While this was going on, we're also looking at some best practices. And one of the things we identified as real low-hanging fruit is the use of mass timber for building structure. And this is part of the national trend following on the International Building Code update that allows tall wood buildings. So recognizing this, we were able to partner with the USDA Forest Service, Climate Works Foundation, and the Softwood Lumber Board, and we're able to put together a program we promptly labeled the Mass Timber Accelerator, because in short, that's really what we set out to do. We saw a lot of promising practice and benefits in mass timber, especially around embodied carbon reduction opportunities. And so the program came together with some pretty straightforward goals. We realized quickly that general awareness was quite low. Public awareness was virtually non-existent. So we wanted to address those considerations. But we also realized practitioners were unfamiliar with mass timber building practices, and literally right down to the details. How do you put the buildings together? But also developers. What are they buying? What do they see? What are the benefits? So we wanted to make sure that we took a holistic approach to engaging stakeholders, engaging professionals, but also broadly educating the public. And we wanted to identify mass timber building opportunities, and frankly, we wanted to build more with mass timber. What I've seen over the years is in fact, practice is one of the best ways to learn, and you're not going to transform an industry unless you start by building some outcomes. Next slide, please. So the program came together with the offering of $25,000 technical grants, but I think also as important were technical assistance that was provided through Woodwork. So we were bringing mass timber building experts into the conversation. We ran two funding rounds and selected a total of 10 teams. The teams were selected based on projects that they had in the permitting process with the city. And so these were real projects, live projects, early in their permitting process. So in this case, this is sometimes referred to as the land use permits. So buildings hadn't been designed, but we were already asking projects, what are you doing to reduce adverse impacts from building development? And what might you do around embodied carbon? So this was a pretty fitting moment to engage project teams. They proposed their particular focuses, their buildings. They assessed conditions. They investigated design solutions. They did life cycle assessments on the materials. And then I think quite importantly, they presented their work to a peer group, the other participants in the program and city folks. We also scheduled education sessions, in particular building code detailed sessions that helped folks really get into the nuts and bolts of putting together a mass timber building. There were some interesting takeaways, and I'll touch on those in a minute, but I think to our goals here, where we've ended up today is something that speaks to the opportunity and the interest and the focus on reducing embodied carbon. And that is, we now are tracking 8 active projects. We have 3 in construction now. We've got more on the way, but we've kind of jumped from about 40,000 square feet of mass timber to 1.3 million square feet. And then more importantly, we have a large bubble, or maybe it's just the whole tide of mass timber projects coming, but we've identified another 22 buildings pushing 4 million square feet that have mass timber commitments and are good opportunities. They're building typologies and uses that really do lend themselves to being built with mass timber. Next slide, please. I just want to highlight a few takeaways. And first is that with the new code, we can build very big buildings out of mass timber. And big buildings fit well in cities like Boston, but they do have a lot of environmental impact, and switching to mass timber means we can dramatically reduce those impacts. In practice, we found a whole bunch of other benefits that really I hadn't even given thought to, but reducing things like building floor to floor height offers a lot of efficiencies that we don't often give thought to. Lower floor to floor heights without compromising floor to ceiling heights means buildings can actually fit more stories in the same allowed height. Things like building enclosure areas, so the exterior of the building, which is a very, very expensive part of buildings, is actually reduced. So there's a bunch of savings there. And then you can follow some of these into more details. Wood as a structure is much lighter than steel and concrete, and that runs right down to building foundations where the substructures are smaller, which are often made of concrete. So there again, we're saving more carbon. But we were finding other benefits, like we can build these buildings more quickly, and that we can source materials regionally. So lots of interesting things, but the real big takeaway was the market value and the beauty and biophilic benefits of wood. When you walk into one of these buildings and you see wood ceilings or beams or columns, there's a very different feel to these kinds of spaces. And I think users of these spaces, whether they're residents or business owners, respond to that. It wasn't all wonderful. There are concerns, growing pains as well, but this is a new practice area. The supply lines in New England aren't robust. There's just a couple of providers, although that is changing as we speak. There is absolutely a new practice premium. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but anybody building their first mass timber building is taking a big risk, and often they will pass that on to their client, the developer. So being on the lookout for those premiums and how to push those down has been an important part. Similarly, the building insurance world is looking at this like, this is new, maybe we need to charge more. It's made of wood. We know wood burns, things like that, that are mostly born of a lack of familiarity or simply uninformed decision-making are present still. And then lastly, Massachusetts is still a few months away from adopting the new building code that will actually allow us to build tall wood buildings. We do expect that to pass shortly. I think a different fun piece, and it really, to me, speaks more to the moment, and that is the interest in launching mass timber accelerator programs nationally. The Forest Service found this to be an exceptional program and has offered funding to cities and states around the country. There are already 2 more mass timber accelerator programs up and running. They simply have a great local focus, back to the goals I've outlined, and have the potential to really impact practice. For Boston, it's been a great way for us to learn about the benefits of building with low carbon materials, and then what we need to do to better understand the market. and to begin tracking this as professionals, as building designers and folks who are focused on impact mitigation. I'll stop there and pass the baton on to our next presenter.
Great. Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. Lots of information. I see some questions already coming in the chat, which we will address later on. So next, I am going to pass it to Thomas O'Neill from the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, so that he can give us some information on their zoning ordinance amendment, which addressed embodied carbon.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thomas O'Neill. I'm a sustainability planner with the City of Cambridge in our Community Development Department. And we can go to the next slide. So the city, so those of you who aren't familiar with Cambridge, we are just over the Charles River from Boston. We cover about 7.5 square miles of land with about 118,000 residents. So we're quite dense. And we have a lot of life sciences and biotech industry in the city, which results in our building stock accounting for about 80% or so of our overall emissions. And understanding this, back in 2015, the city went through a process to develop a net zero action plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 in our building stock. And we commit to doing a 5-year update of that plan every 5 years. And so the first update, which was adopted in 2023, was quite different from the original plan from 2015, in that there was a new action to address embodied carbon specifically. And the way that that plan came together was a stakeholder group of residents, industry professionals, people who work in Cambridge were all brought together to figure out how we should change our actions to address the full climate impact of our buildings. And so while we had that action laid out in our net zero action plan, it was really the push from our city council to actually get us started on that work. So we had a city councilor last year who petitioned a new zoning amendment to Article 22 in our zoning ordinance, which is our green building requirements. And so we worked with city council to kind of develop exactly what that language should look like. And it came out to be that new projects over 50,000 square feet that exclude residential units will be now required to report on their embodied carbon. And they will do that through what we call our net zero narrative, which before the adoption of this zoning ordinance only focused on operational emissions, but now also includes embodied emissions as well. And so last year we worked with some consultants to help us put together a reporting template and educational toolkit, which Michelle Lambert here was a part of and did a fantastic job with helping us understand what exactly we should be asking for and looking for through doing a whole building lifecycle analyses and how to really kind of help communicate these requirements to developers. And so we can go to the next slide. And so while it's great that we have this policy in place, there have been some challenges that we have faced. Partly, it has been really difficult to actually collect this data. Development in Cambridge kind of happens on a boom and bust cycle, and I think we are just kind of in a lower time for new projects. Our requirements are also quite narrow with the exclusion of residential units, and a lot of new construction happening, a lot of really big new construction is usually mixed use. And so the exclusion of residential kind of really does hinder the projects that will end up reporting on this requirement. Another challenge that we are facing is in Cambridge, we have adopted a lot of new policies over the past year for new construction, that being this embodied carbon reporting requirement, but also the Massachusetts specialized opt-in stretch code. And Cambridge was selected as one of the 10 communities to do a fossil fuel-free new construction demonstration pilot program. And so just kind of getting the developer community educated on all of these different requirements that are now in place is another challenge that we are dealing with. But overall, I think that the development of our embodied carbon policy has been quite successful. While we are putting together our toolkit and our reporting template, we did some stakeholder discussions, we did some industry outreach with architects, sustainability consultants, engineers to really understand what was happening in the field around this already. Because another challenge that we are seeing, that we try to better understand through our reporting requirement is that the industry is moving at a different pace than policy. We heard that a lot of developers have internal embodied carbon reduction targets. And what we are looking to do with our kind of data collection is understand the embodied carbon landscape right now, and then we can use that information to then set a baseline for which we can then require future reductions against. But collecting that data has been slow. And we can go to the next slide. And so some of the lessons that we learned through doing this work, we had to move quite quickly from the zoning petition that City Council filed to getting our reporting template out there. And that did make the engagement process feel a little bit rushed. So I would definitely encourage people to take as much time as they need, just because this is all really new stuff and it's complicated, but so important. And it was really, what really helped make this successful for us was the support of our city council. They really did spur us to do this work, even though we had it in our net zero action plan. It kind of like set the fire to get us working on it. So that kind of dedicated leadership does go a long way. So I will leave it at that, but please feel free to put any questions in the chat.
Great, thank you so much, Thomas. Just reiterating that Massachusetts, Cambridge was the first municipality to have a zoning policy adopted that addressed embodied carbon. And staying in the theme of Massachusetts policies, we're going to move to the city of Newton, Massachusetts, which was the second community to adopt zoning specifically to address embodied carbon. And unfortunately, no one was able to make it from the city of Newton today. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the zoning ordinance, and then they did offer to share their contact information if anyone has specific questions about Newton's policy. So briefly, again, kind of this theme of climate action plans, laying the groundwork for future action. In 2019, Newton adopted its first climate action plan, and the goal that they set was to be carbon neutral by 2050. And in the same year, they also adopted a sustainable development design ordinance, which included a number of sustainability requirements for projects over 20,000 square feet. Many of those were, green building certifications, other things related to operational energy efficiency. But at that time, they actually included a placeholder for embodied carbon to be filled out and addressed at a future time. And then in the fall of 2021, Green Newton, which is a local citizen advocacy organization that happens to have a lot of building professionals within that group, have a building standards committee, and they help to draft and propose the language to address embodied carbon within Newton's special permits. And in Newton, special permits are required for almost all new construction projects over 20,000 square feet. So it would essentially, address a pretty large number of projects going through the process. And then finally, in April of 2023, the City Council approved the language just 1 month after the City of Cambridge approved their language. And there was quite strong support at that point from the council zoning and the planning committee. So just some of the specifics of the program include projects between 20,000 and 50,000 square feet have to estimate the embodied carbon of just their structure as a starting point for somewhat smaller projects. And then projects over 50,000 square feet have to estimate embodied carbon of their structure and enclosure. It is not prescriptive. It leaves the method and the tools for doing that assessment open to the design team at this point. And then there's also an item in there that says that if you are a project reusing 50% of an existing building, then you are exempt from doing that analysis. So in that way, helping to incentivize building reuse as well. So when you submit for your permit, you have to first include a narrative which describes how you're going to address embodied carbon. And then when you submit for your building permit, you must submit the actual life cycle assessment or embodied carbon analysis that you performed. So some of the challenges that they, if everyone could also mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you.
Just asking what the question is, so I'll do that.
So some of the challenges that they faced were that early drafts of these proposed regulations were hoping to address the embodied carbon of concrete specifically, but through some legal review with the city of Newton, they learned that the Massachusetts State Building Code precluded municipalities from specifically regulating building materials. So it couldn't be material specific. It had to be more open-ended in terms of addressing all materials. One challenge is that just this past December, a new by right zoning, some options were introduced, which could allow developers to bypass the special permit process. And in this case, this ordinance only applied to special permits. So there's a possibility that this may have to find a new iteration in the future if it can be bypassed by a large number of projects. And then they also noted that small 1 and 2 family homes account for most of the new construction actually in the city of Newton, and those are not included in the ordinance. So that is something they would like to address in the future. Some of the keys to success that were pointed out, again, sort of mirroring what others have said, the education of city councilors and others explaining how you measure embodied carbon, what it is, how you address it, really spending the time to do that education. And they were fortunate, as I mentioned, to have some really knowledgeable and engaged volunteers in the city as part of that Green Newton organization. And they were really involved in this process from start to finish. And then also, they noted that one of their successes is really due to a city administration and a city council that recognize the dangers of climate change and were willing to take action on this issue. So next in our zoning and permitting category, we're going to move out of Massachusetts to the city of Toronto and hear about their green standard from Zach Zandona from the City of Toronto Environment and Climate Division.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. Again, my name is Zach Zandona. I'm a project lead with the City of Toronto's Environment and Climate Division. And our division is responsible for addressing our Transform TO mandate, which is to make the city net zero by 2040. And we work really, really closely with our planning department, who owns the Toronto Green Standard policy. We help out with that implementation on reviewing energy modeling reports, LCAs, with respect to the energy and emissions portion of the Toronto Green Standard. Next slide, please. So just a bit of background on the Toronto Green Standard. It is Toronto's green development performance requirements. And it was introduced in 2006 and voluntary until 2010. And there are mandatory requirements related to water quality, energy and emissions, ecology, soil quality across the board. But we mainly work on energy and emissions on my team. So we're in the 4th iteration of the Toronto Green Standard. Since it started every 4 years, the requirements get more and more strict. The minimum requirement gets dropped off, and it is a tiered system. So there are voluntary tiers above tier 1. So every 4 years, that tier 1 gets dropped, and the next tier becomes the mandatory tier. So back in July of 2021, we got council direction to look into embodied carbon, explore it, and see if we could incorporate it into the Toronto Green Standard. We ended up carrying out a couple of benchmarking studies and proposed embodied carbon caps for new development. And then last year, but almost exactly a year ago, council adopted our embodied carbon caps. So next slide, please. So we have mandatory embodied carbon caps for city-owned buildings, and this is all tied to site plan application. Apologies if I didn't mention that before. So we have mandatory caps for city-owned buildings and voluntary caps for private development. And again, these caps were established based on 2 benchmarking studies that we carried out with Mantle Developments, Half Climate Design, and Builders for Climate Action. And in these benchmarking studies, we looked at a number of Part 3 buildings. So that's, commercial, residential, and Part 9 buildings, which is townhouses, low-rise townhouses. And those are all buildings in the Greater Toronto area. And again, we used our Transform TO mandate to propel this work because we've had operational requirements for a number of years now, and now to bring in these embodied carbon caps was something that could easily be done. Next slide, please. So here are the results of the benchmarking study. We looked at about 503 buildings that were low-rise Part 9 townhouses, 15 residential, 5 commercial office retail, and 21 other building types. In the red here, red flag, you can see what the proposed caps were at the time. All of these numbers here are based on cradle to grave life cycle assessments for the structure and envelope. And so our caps ended up being, we decided to be a bit more ambitious than these proposed caps here, just because our caps are based on upfront emissions only, so life cycle stages A1 to A5 or A1 to A3 for low rise, and also because the caps are voluntary for the most part. So we decided to be a bit ambitious. And go to the next slide, please. So the mandatory and Tier 2 private development caps are 350 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for residential and commercial, and 400 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for other building types. And then the voluntary cap for low-rise residential, so townhouses, is 250 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, and that's just for life cycles stages A1 to A3. And lastly, the voluntary Tier 3 for private and high-performance city-owned targets are 250 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for residential and commercial, and 275 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for other building types. Please go to the next slide. So again, we had a couple challenges. We didn't have any data related to the embodied carbon associated with buildings in the area. We had to seek funding from the Atmospheric Fund here. So we had to go through a bit of a process, but we ended up carrying out that benchmarking study with those consultants I mentioned before in order to get that data. And in consultation with stakeholders, there were concerns about mandatory caps, which is why we stuck to voluntary caps for now, except for when it comes to city-owned buildings. But this is basically a message to the industry saying this is something that we're looking at, we're really considering at the moment. So it's something that may be mandatory coming as part of future versions of the Toronto Green Standard. We did look at a couple of our city-owned projects that have already been built to see what the embodied carbon was associated with those structures, and we found that they were meeting the caps. So we know that the caps are achievable. We haven't had many projects come in yet that are subject to the caps. We're still waiting on a couple to come through the pipeline, but we're expecting them to meet the caps for sure. And that's about it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Zach.
No problem.
So that wraps up the section of our zoning policies. And again, if you have questions, either specific to a policy or general, please definitely put them in the Q&A box. And we are going to move on now to the government procurement section of policy. This map was created by CLF, and it shows the current snapshot of Buy Clean procurement policies that have both been introduced and passed in the United States as of this month. And you can see, the color coding, some of them address both buildings and infrastructure, some just buildings, some just infrastructure. In the darker gray are ones introduced but not passed. And then below, you'll see that there are also some federal agencies that have passed Buy Clean policy for various construction materials, and some local policies as well. So there's a pretty, quickly moving field of procurement and Buy Clean policies in the US. So we are going to talk specifically about New Jersey's Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, or LECLA. And I'm going to present the slides, and then we also have Sue Dorward and Sean Moen with us that can provide some more detail and answer questions as they were directly involved in the policy. So the New Jersey LECLA is a policy that uses a performance incentive approach, and it awards tax incentives to concrete producers who can supply concrete less than a certain threshold of embodied carbon. One of their primary goals was to create a market incentive for material producers to manufacture lower embodied carbon construction materials, specifically starting with concrete. And the New Jersey LECLA was passed in 2023, and it was based on the New York State LECLA, which was actually passed in 2019. So the way that the program specifically works is that ready-mix concrete suppliers who can demonstrate that their concrete is under a global warming potential threshold can receive a tax credit up to 5% of their total bid price. So an actual financial incentive in this case. And then there's an additional incentive as well if suppliers use concrete that incorporates carbon capture, utilization, or storage technology. And this applies to state buildings and infrastructure projects. So a little bit about the policy development. Open Air Collective is a organization, a volunteer-led global network organization focused on accelerating carbon removal. And their members, their volunteer members, researched and developed and wrote various versions of the LECLA, supporting the introduction of it in a few different state legislatures. So they were a really important part of the development of the legislation. Citizen lobbying was also a significant component and included a lot of direct engagement by citizen advocates to build support and to get co-sponsorship by legislators and governors within the state. And then finally, coalition building. Lots of outreach activities were aimed at education, enlisting stakeholders. We've heard that theme, I think, a number of times about the importance of education and engaging stakeholders to be involved in the process. So some of the stakeholders, there was a pretty large collective of grassroots activists, including the Open Air Collective, who also worked closely with the Natural Resources Defense Council and the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters. A couple of the challenges noted were that specifically some groups were pushing for the reduction of any cement use and the reduction of concrete overall. Some other concerns voiced from a local environmental group that this policy could potentially inadvertently lead to the burning of landfill waste. And finally, some general contractors and building trades were voicing concerns around building safety with lower embodied carbon concrete, which I think again speaks to the need for engaging with industry and providing education and resources around what is lower embodied carbon concrete. Some of the keys to success that they noted were successful discussions with the Associated Construction Contractors Association and the Utility and Contractors Association, so directly engaging with those construction and concrete industry groups. And they noted that using a tax incentive rather than a bid preference or a low carbon concrete requirement, so an incentive rather than a requirement, was really critical to garnering some strong bipartisan support for the act. And then the policy's emphasis on performance specifications rather than prescriptive specifications allowed for really increased innovation and buy-in from multiple stakeholders because they had that flexibility built in. So like I said, if you have questions about the procurement policy, feel free to put those in the Q&A. And the next category of embodied carbon policy is building codes and bylaws. John Delzell touched a little bit on building codes related to mass timber. And we are now going to hear from Jacob Deva-Rakusin from New Frameworks to talk a little bit about Vermont's Energy Code Amendment.
Hey folks, good to be with you all. I'm Jacob Deva-Rakusin, New Frameworks. I'm the Director of Building Science and Sustainability. I also wear a hat with Brewers Climate Action, so we were involved a bit with the Toronto work on some of the Part 9 embodied carbon stuff. But for this one in Vermont, which is where New Frameworks is located, I was involved as a practitioner. We are a design, build, and fabrication cooperative here in Vermont, and worked with Efficiency Vermont, which is our regional efficiency utility, to help develop some language around inclusion in our state energy code. So we'll talk about that. All right, next slide. So there's a funny thing here in Vermont where there is no statewide building code at all. There are some municipal building codes, but for the most part, residential construction flies like heavily under the radar, way under the regulatory radar. There's even very lax zoning policy on a statewide basis because we are a super rural state. And so in some towns, there's literally no zoning or building code whatsoever. So what we do have is a statewide energy code. And so in the interest in trying to bring embodied carbon policy into the state, we saw the statewide energy standard. It goes by the acronym RBES for the Residential Building Energy Standard, and CBES, which is the Commercial Building Energy Standard. So you'll see both of those acronyms on the screen over the course of the next few slides. So our intention was to bring into the energy code a mechanism on a wide basis of bringing embodied carbon policy into the purview. So the code is updated every 3 years. We initially introduced this back in 2018 for the 2020 code cycle, and there was a lot of interest, but it didn't quite make the final cut. We kept pushing on it, and it will be going into the code. It got accepted, it got adopted by the state, and will be going into the code when that kicks in July. So the kind of unique thing about this approach is because it's an energy code, we needed to find a way to make this specifically to energy, because the code is not around carbon, it's not around zoning, it's not around buildings, it's explicitly around energy. And so our angle was to look at the direct relationship between enclosure performance requirements and an increasingly more sort of stringent energy code, which would result in more insulation material consumption, and recognizing there's an impact on embodied carbon for that increased material consumption. And so that was the logic in being able to bring this provision into the energy standard. Next slide. And so the way that works, I guess maybe the other thing I can mention there, I'll mention that when we talk about the challenges. I'll describe what happened here first. So the way that ended up getting structured in this first pass is that there is a table for calculating what the embodied carbon is of your insulation materials. Is a very simple. Essentially, materials take off with an applied emission factor that was developed by Efficiency Vermont. And we give credit to Brian Just as a senior engineer there, who sort of researched and published the emission standards or emission factors, pardon me, for those insulation materials. The way that and so the structure within the code is a few different compliance pathways. One of those pathways is essentially a prescription plus points pathway, where you have to have a few meet a partially prescriptive level of requirements around your insulation levels and air sealing levels, and then apply for a certain number of points in addition to that, those prescriptive moves. And the point structure allows for 1 to 3 points for for trying to address the embodied carbon of your insulation materials. So you get 1 point just for putting a number in the system, and then you get 2 or 3 points if you are certain percentages below baseline. The RBES program is, well, it's all, both RBES and CBES are self-reported because we're Vermont and we don't have the regulatory body to actually oversee this process. However, there are a series of sticks, depending on whether you're a residential or commercial project, as to what compels you to report. There are more sticks on the commercial side than the residential side. Next slide. So a few pieces around sort of both the challenges and what worked well. Certainly the educational efforts were significant, as you can probably surmise by the fact that we don't even have a regulatory body to enforce the energy code. There's not a tremendous amount of appetite, let alone literacy, around introducing new content areas into the code. So that did take a fair amount of work. However, there's a really strong sort of cultural appreciation around environmental impact in Vermont. And so there was a lot, even within the practitioners in the room who are usually not enthusiastic about additional regulations, there's a lot of support. It took a lot of work to educate, but the support was, weren't sure what the background embodied carbon was. This could be a slippery slope to lots of other issues. Probably the other big issue is, well, why is this going into an energy standard? And so when we were developing this approach, we recognized that the Vermont statute names part of the goal of having an energy standard is to reduce the state's climate impact. And so because there's an association in following the code that's increasing material consumption that could lead to an increase in carbon emissions, which is partially the intent of the code, that gave the justification that the state accepted for including that. And that was a successful argument for us. We had a lot of support from Builders for Climate Action from a technical standpoint. VEIC, which is the parent corporation of Efficiency Vermont, did a lot, including creating the materials that were included in the code. And then there were folks within the state that really wanted to see this happen as well, and were really open to try and find a way to help make it possible for the energy code to capture this level of content. Probably the other thing worth naming, looking to the future, I don't think I have a slide on this, so I'll just slip it in here. Definitely recognizing that it is pretty suboptimal having sort of bespoke emissions factors that are sort of embedded into the regulatory language and having this bespoke calculation tool. So we're looking in the next cycle of the code, which is about to start up again, how to look at other sort of commonly applicable emission factor resources and validation tools that can be used, so it's not quite such a special and unique thing held only within Vermont's energy standard, that it can be more standardized towards other data sets and tool sets on the market and utilized by other jurisdictions. Next slide, unless that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacob. I think it's great. We're hearing a lot of different approaches based on the way that different jurisdictions are run, the way that codes are, exist or don't exist. So I think it's really interesting to hear how different states and regions have approached this based on, their specific circumstances. So, but exciting that it is in the energy code. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we are going to talk about deconstruction and reuse policies. And we are going to hear from Michael Orbank, who is with STO Building Group. And he also is the lead of the reuse working group of CLF's Boston Northeast Hub. And he is going to talk a bit about the City of Boston's Zero Waste Deconstruction Initiative.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. As Michelle said, my name is Michael Orbank. I work in construction sustainability and also chair the CLF Boston Northeast Reuse Group. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So in 2019, Boston's Environment Department published a zero waste plan. And from that, the zero waste movement really, with the Department of the Environment, thought, well, what are the kind of next steps for this? And then looking at deconstruction and reuse and the CLF Reuse Group, we really started conversations to see what would a deconstruction or reuse policy or ordinance look like in the city of Boston. So in talking with them, they really had a lot of strong goals to not only really decarbonize, but also go through and really reap a lot of the other benefits that can come with economic and workforce development, really maintaining the culture and what the feel of Boston is through adaptive reuse, and really just pushing and promoting the kind of circular economy forward in all of this. So they started off in January 2021, and their third pilot project was finished in late 2022. And really just, like I said, looking to not only address embodied carbon, but really just work towards what better looks like towards zero waste. Next slide, please. So the program actions for all pilot projects and going through really follow these 4 steps. Starting out with fact finding, there's a lot that the Environment Department didn't know. So really asking what's possible right now, going through some industry research and discovery. I was brought in as a technical expert along with Recycling Works Massachusetts, who works through the Mass DEP to really provide that no-cost technical assistance and looking through different connections. And then the next action for each of these pilots was to really say, what are the impacts that we're looking to track, and really how does circularity support zero waste on these projects? There's a lot of data that can be pulled from it, and really understanding kind of what is being done on these projects to then inform the policy that will go over all kind of commercial projects. Our next step was looking at course correction through pulling out this data, what exactly needs to change, how can the existing green building laws that exist in the city of Boston be either tweaked, amended, or added to really make sure that deconstruction is incentivized and realized as a way to decarbonize and meet a lot of the either carbon or waste goals. And then lastly, expanding and refining kind of how is this circular policy realized in the city of Boston, and finding what resources need to be provided to the industry, what support, and really what does incentivizing really look like. I'll also say that the Boston Landmarks Commission, the IGBC, were very helpful and continue to be helpful as this program looks to kind of continue and improve to really determine what buildings and what projects around the city are good candidates. Not only maybe they're leaning towards wanting to be part of this, but also making sure that this initiative isn't just targeting certain building types, but can get the most amount of information from the industry in the built environment. Next slide, please. So, especially coming from the contractor side, there were some challenges in setting a lot of these projects up, and a lot of that comes with the lack of early action. When implementing kind of sustainability on a project, but also looking at from a broader policy perspective, a lack of this is what we're going to do on the front end oftentimes leads to a lot of problems on the back end. So not having project requirements that list circular requirements and really meant that a lot of times there was triaging, reuse, and deconstruction last minute. How are we going to go about doing this, trying to find those resources? When it came to design, if there weren't any kind of explicit circular requirements on reusing materials or material specs, it was hard to kind of establish that. And then especially on the construction and demo side, asking kind of in the 11th hour, maybe right before the project went to demo, to implement a lot of these reuse practices or go out of your way to deconstruct in what is known as maybe a best practice in other municipalities around the West Coast, led to a bit of frustration and I would say mounting costs, especially on the construction side. And then another challenge was just a bit of an ignorance of scope and scale. Changing policy like pushing towards deconstruction and reuse means that you're not just pulling one lever and affecting one or two stakeholders. You're really looking to kind of really impact the entire industry and finding a lot of these reuse outlets that may exist right now, but can be nascent or really underutilized and under-refined. And then I put in a bullet there, really challenging a lot of these entrenched norms. The city of Boston, especially working on the construction side, is a very kind of old school union mentality, and injecting a lot of innovation sometimes can be tough. And the fact that if it isn't an accepted practice, oftentimes it is either shunned or said, well, it's going to cost much more or be too difficult to implement. But through these pilot projects and looking forward, there have been a lot of realized opportunities. Because the city of Boston has so many colleges and institutional owners, many are really eager to work with the city to really see, how can we be part of it? How can we either lend these projects or lend kind of our research capabilities? In the small publicizing that has went on with this initiative, there has been a real market signal that started to shift. I would say even in the CLF Boston Reuse Group, we've had new members come and say, I heard that the city is going forward with this. I want to learn more. But really from a policy perspective, realizing that permitting costs and schedule benefits that come with kind of deconstruction incentives that are seen on the West Coast in places like Seattle and Portland are really helpful in incentivizing a kind of, at times, stubborn construction industry. Construction is time and money, and finding out that you can incentivize that and push towards deconstruction when asking for free demo salvage assessments and deconstruction plans has been a powerful realization. And then also really combining and synergizing these benefits of what a deconstruction and reuse policy would bring, benefiting kind of workforce development and synergizing with a lot of social justice initiatives that the mayor and the city of Boston have. And then lastly, for realized opportunity, I mentioned it earlier, but Boston has a lot of historic character, and many in the city are very proud of kind of the brownstone feel and walking on the cobblestone streets at times. So really utilizing other successful ordinances such as San Antonio, Texas, where their deconstruction and reuse ordinance really started with a historic preservation aspect and frameship. So while a lot of this has come from embodied carbon, there are a lot more realized benefits as well. Next slide. So really looking at the keys to success as the city of Boston looks to expand this and bring on more pilots, really tying this initiative directly to the Boston Zero Waste Plan and taking policy and ordinance inspiration from other successful municipalities, whether they are on the West Coast, whether they're, I mentioned San Antonio. But also when talking about this and when pushing this, really framing deconstruction and adaptive reuse as a benefit to not only decarbonization, but economic and workforce development, affordable housing, and historic preservation, and really looking to add on to existing municipal green building requirements, not looking to kind of remake the wheel and introduce something that people or the industry is incredibly new to, but saying we're already all used to the process and a lot of these building requirements to go through the environmental review and what we need. We're just adding on to that or really refining some of that to include deconstruction and circularity. And then lastly, really looking to support the local industry and create a policy that is uniquely Boston. A lot of us here are very kind of proud of working and being in here, and that feel definitely would lead to something that we can all be very proud of. So I think that's it. I'll pass it back to you, Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. I think we're getting a lot of really fantastic information quickly, and it's really exciting to see the breadth of these policies, like I mentioned. Thank you so much. So the last category is planned actions. And we're going to start with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey's Clean Construction Program. I will give the overview, and we also have Amy Cole with us from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey to answer questions. So starting off, the program was launched in 2020, and the first focus of this clean construction program was on concrete. The Port Authority took the step of going back and evaluating all of their past concrete mixes and what the global warming potential of those mixes had been. And in April 2023, we're able to use that research and that data to add enforceable concrete GWP limits into their specifications. So from the start, they had a number of goals with this program: reducing carbon emissions from construction, obviously, also promoting the reduction and reuse of C&D waste, promoting the circular economy was a goal of this program, and reducing air quality impacts of construction activities. So some of the specific program actions that are part of this are sustainable construction requirements, including specifications for low carbon concrete mixes, but also low emission construction vehicles and a targeted construction waste reduction. They're also put in place some environmental product or EPD requirements that would support the systematic collection of that data so that they can further track their progress, track their data. They had their prior data, now they're tracking the data that's coming in currently, and be able to improve the practice over time as they're tracking what the GWP of those mixes is. And then also construction waste matching and reuse was another piece of this, looking at reducing landfill and curtailing truck trips from construction waste and landfilling. Some of the challenges that they noted, there's a lot of themes I think that we're hearing, and even across different policy types. But they specifically reached out to the industry, met with the ready mix concrete suppliers multiple times, brought them into the conversation, as well as industry associations, and had conversations about what their concerns were and how they could be addressed. They also had a focus on specifically ensuring that the smaller suppliers, the small ready mix suppliers, would not be precluded from doing business with the agency because of these new requirements. So they also made sure to bring those smaller suppliers into the conversations as well. Some of their keys to success, as I mentioned, one of their goals was really to lead by example. I think a lot of the policies that we've heard about are really hoping to be first, lead by example, and then send a signal to the market. So they were pushing for change in order to participate in that shift in the market towards the production of lower carbon construction materials. They successfully engaged their industry and agency partners as well through this process. And they noted that they really benefited from some academic assistance from the Center for Advanced Infrastructure and Transportation at Rutgers, who worked closely with the authority to help them develop those concrete emissions factors, help them baseline the GWP of all their past concrete mixes, and created and tested some new lower concrete mixes for them. So that partnership with the university was something that really benefited this program. And then last, but certainly not least, is the New York State's Executive Order 22. And I think we have Marianne Jang with the New York Office of General Services here to talk a little bit about that program. Great, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. Can you hear me okay? Great, okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So I'm here to talk about the Executive Order 22 and I should say specifically about the embodied carbon guidance as part of that. Just go to the next slide, please. So in the executive order, which is also called leading by example, it's sort of the governor's, sort of directive to try and lead on sustainability operationally throughout the state. And there are a number of topics covered, of which embodied carbon is one. And the way it was written in the Executive Order 22, obviously we were going to new construction and major renovation projects are going to look at reducing embodied carbon through the materials used. And the EO was pretty forward looking, and it looked at, and it sort of mentioned that we at the state level would be looking at both life cycle assessment for whole projects and also EPDs. And so I came on board and started working with the state in September of 21. And when I started working on this, my first step was to start talking to all the sort of major contracting agencies and authorities across the state, because as I'm sure many of you are in a similar situation, are aware that different agencies and authorities contract for projects in different ways. And the first step was really, I worked very closely with a colleague from NYSERDA called Mikhail Haramati, who some of you may know of. We really started to try and understand where the state was at this point on this topic. And so, spoke to, I'd say, a dozen of the contracting agencies across the state to understand sort of, what their processes were, where they were on this topic. And if you move to the next slide, please. Here are some of the sort of stakeholders that we engaged with. A lot of it was through the Green New York Council, which is a sustainability sort of body, let's say, on behalf of the state. It's co-led by 5 agencies and authorities. So ourselves, NYSERDA, Department of Environmental Conservation, New York Power Authority, and the Division of Budget. And here listed are some other affected entities, we call them, but agencies and authorities who report to the governor. And essentially, in talking, basically talking through, this sort of topic with a range of different actors, we realized that there really wasn't a ton of capacity in this area for the state. And so our first step was really to think about how to create a stepwise approach for reducing embodied carbon in the state. And so what that led to was the embodied carbon guidance that was issued in June of 2023. And it starts with requiring collection of EPDs where it exists, I should say. So not requiring, collection of EPDs where it exists. And this for us really represented a first step. It was to say, across the state now, for common construction materials: concrete, steel, glass, and asphalt. And for that, we looked, across the country and at what the GSA was doing. But for these 4 major construction materials, above a minimum threshold, because we didn't want to impact some of the smaller projects, and where your project is over $1 million, we're now asking for EPDs for these materials. And we've already started to see, and so we required this. We required this to go into contracts starting October of 23. And so they have gone in, and as of now, we're starting to see some EPDs come in. We're also starting to see some waiver letters come in where there's no EPD available. So the market signal it's clearly out there now, and it's sort of exciting to see, industry sort of respond to that. The second, so that's the first phase. As I said, it was going to be more of a stepwise approach. The second phase that we're going to start working on soon is developing a life cycle assessment, essentially, of whole projects. So a methodology for doing this. And we recognize this is going to be very challenging because we have a wide range of projects. And in addition, our remit is both building and transportation projects, which is, I know, sort of unusual. So we're going to be working with a consultant. We've won a grant from the U.S. Climate Alliance to work on this. So we'll be working together with a consultant to try and figure out how we can, following the approach we had, with the collection of EPDs, where we were really able to engage with a lot of stakeholders to develop that guidance and roll it out in a really sort of effective way, see what we can do, how we can mirror that approach for the life cycle assessment methodology as well. And a key, I think, part of all of the rollout and the success of all this has been our interagency embodied carbon working group. And so this is a working group made up of individuals across these affected state agencies who are tasked with implementing, in this case, requiring EPD collection, understanding how they're going to report that, and we have a sort of a monthly meeting. We also, as a result of that monthly meeting and recognizing that we need to sort of build more capacity on the topic, have a monthly public webinar series, which are all welcome to join. I should have put the link here, but it's on the ogs.ny.gov website. So if you go there, you can find a link to the, maybe I can stick it in after in the chat. But we have a public webinar series where it started in October. We've been asking, at the beginning, it was sort of foundational topics like embodied carbon 101, low carbon concrete 101, and I forget the next. And then we more recently have started to ask EPD software companies to come and present. So we've heard from One Click, we've heard from Climate Earth. We're going to hear from WAP Sustainability later on this month. Then we'll hear from from Napa on their asphalt EPD tool, and then hopefully from someone from the steel industry, and then from glass. Oh, thanks, Jordan. I appreciate that. And those recordings are on the website as well. So if you missed it, you can always catch up that way. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, some of the challenges, these are sort of challenges that came up in conversation with the stakeholders that really informed the way that we developed the guidance. But there was a lot of concern about, the potential time and effort demands of the reporting process and the burden on the contractors and suppliers. We also note that, there was concern, especially for some of the smaller concrete suppliers in sort of more rural areas who probably, have probably not heard of what an EPD is and wouldn't even know where to start with generating those. We also heard that, data collection and tracking were going to be tricky. And so as a result, we identified EC3 as a partner to help us. And so there is a New York State template, which is publicly available within EC3, which is, free for any contractor who's reporting on a New York State project to use. And some of the keys to success have been that I think one thing that I think I already mentioned is sort of the intense engagement with other state agencies and affected entities to really understand where they are and where they're starting from. And they're all obviously starting from different places, but a really good understanding and bringing them up to speed as we start developing the guidance. So we really engage them throughout the process. Education was really important as a result of that. So you can see through the webinars, the working group. And we also, in addition, when we set up the EC3 template, the New York State template within EC3, we beta tested that template. So we had 3 or 4 agencies test that first, enter some example projects, and then give us some feedback before we rolled it out across the state. So all in all, I think in short, for us, I think a key part of this has really been the partnership with the different agencies across the state.
Great, thank you so much, Marianne. So those are the 9 policies. I mean, I think that we've all really heard a great, overview and types of policies and breadth, and clearly have received the message that the Northeast part of the US and Canada is embracing embodied carbon policy and moving forward, quickly. And a lot of these policies, can be used for models for other municipalities and agencies as well. So I appreciate everyone being very timely. We have about 10 minutes available for questions. So if you could, panelists, please turn your cameras on. And there were a couple of questions that were answered in the chat. So I'll start with the ones that have not been answered yet, and we'll hopefully get through as many as we can. So the first one that came in was in general around incentivizing reporting beyond structure and envelope in some way. Is anyone tackling this in a meaningful way? So any policies or conversations around going beyond structure and envelope in assessment of embodied carbon? I think a lot of the policies we heard talked about structure and enclosure and insulation, and anyone going beyond or had conversations about going beyond?
Well, in New Jersey, we were doing concrete, and a lot of that is Department of Transportation, and roads and bridges and things like that, sidewalks. So not specifically structures so much. And the DOT, they're very conservative, and they were reluctant to embrace newer solutions. But I think that's just part of the process of educating them. And then on top of that, having the baseline data has certainly been an issue of trying to collect that. So I appreciate seeing all of these other approaches that address that head on. So we're kind of having to catch up on that at this point.
I guess I could add that we also sort of talked about this, but I think from our perspective, I think for the initial phase in collecting EPDs, because it was so new to our state agencies, we really wanted to start with sort of just larger quantities of materials that were being used, and that sort of mostly relate, so it's mostly sort of relates to sort of structure and envelope. But we're hoping that in the next phase of the guidance that we develop, that's more around the life cycle assessment of a project, that we will capture other materials that are contributing to the embodied carbon and sort of looking for a reduction overall.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting, to see how many of these policies, like Sue was mentioning, are not just buildings, but also looking at the infrastructure. But anyone talk about, you were touching on it, Marianne, any interiors or other materials within the building? And I think that kind of also touches on the next question from Jennifer Hardy, which was specifically about the Newton ordinance. Do you know how they are calculating the 50% reuse of the existing building? And is it just structure or structure and enclosure, or does it include interior fit out as well? So I believe it is structure and enclosure. I am fairly certain that it does not include interior fit out. That does seem to be the next frontier of looking at materials, and embodied carbon is all these interior fit out materials. And I don't know the specific methodology off the top of my head of how they're calculating. I think that it is the surface area of materials, but like I mentioned, the report has links to all of the actual ordinance language of all these policies and other links. So hopefully the specifics of those calculations are in there. Okay, next question is for Marianne and all the other regions that are using project value for identifying applicability threshold. Doesn't using a dollar value create a loophole? For example, projects reporting value below $1 million to bypass the requirements.
That is a really good question, Zara, and actually something that we're trying to we're working through in our working group. Interestingly, the question that we've gotten is, we're a project that's just under $1 million, but there could be some, sort of work order changes that bring us to over $1 million. So initially we're not, we don't meet the threshold, but but we probably will. So we're going to be reported, so we've had agencies say we're going to start reporting projects that are under $1 million because we think we're going to be over $1 million at some point anyway. So there are some agencies who are proactively just starting to track for lower value, dollar value projects. It is for those agencies who aren't proactively doing that, it is something that we're thinking about of how to avoid this loophole. One thing that we do have is we also require, in addition to sort of just the EPD reporting, is an annual project list. And so we ask for sort of like the denominator of what are all the projects that your agency is working on, so that we can start to see how many projects we are maybe not catching because we've created this $1 million value threshold. So I think the data sort of needs to play itself out a little bit. We won't get that report till later this year. So yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's one that we're also tackling with. But luckily we do have some agencies like our DOT who have decided to ignore our $1 million threshold and are just reporting all their projects.
Great, thank you. A number of the policies use square footage as a project threshold, and then others use the dollar value. Are there others that use the dollar value that want to comment on how, identifying those thresholds and projects that fall in the loophole? I do think a lot of the thresholds were based on project size, so that might be somewhat unique to that. And then the next question also is for you, Marianne. I think that Jordan already put the website link for the public webinar series, which is great. Thank you. And then as well, do you have any suggestions for identifying consultants who work with state agencies to develop guidance in this area?
Well, what we primarily did was we talked to, thanks to Mikhail, who was around, my colleague who did a lot of outreach. We spoke to a lot of experts in the field, including many on this call. And we sort of kept asking everyone, well, who would you work with if you had developed this guidance? And a couple of names came up very frequently, CLF being one of them. Jacob is another. So there are a handful of, I think, the experts on the, on this topic. And I would say many of them are on this call. But I would say starting with CLF, as a starting point is a great place. And I'm not just saying that because I'm talking on their webinar.
That's great, thank you. I mean, and as I mentioned too, there's a whole number of resources and webinars and things that we offer on our website, and obviously feel free to reach out to us as well if you have needs. Okay, a couple of minutes left. We have a question for all panelists. Were there challenges in developing these policies when considering the domestic preference requirements, e.g. Buy American, from federal and state governments. Did that come up in anyone's development or conversations?
I can also sort of speak to that.
Okay.
So we have a bike clean concrete guidelines in addition to our embodied carbon guidance, which I didn't actually speak to in these slides. But when we were developing those, we were sort of mirroring what the federal government had done in terms of their buy clean procurement, which is not just buy clean but also buy American. And so it's something that we discussed, and we were pro the idea of sourcing locally, as a way of both buy clean, but also, staying local. So I can add that.
Great. Anyone else? And then Zara actually had a follow-up question, which I think would be interesting to broaden a little bit too, about the best way to identify smaller or odd projects. Do we talk a little bit about, do you use project size? Do you use project value? I think it was the city of Newton specifically commented on the fact that they recognize a lot of their construction is single and small residential projects that fall under the radar of their ordinance. Anyone want to comment on how to address, it's the next phase, or how to address the smaller projects, the single family and small residential and all those projects that fall under either the value or the size thresholds for many of these policies?
I can speak to that a bit. I would not say that like Vermont structure provides like a whole lot of replicable like guidance, because we're just kind of unique in our regulatory structure. But I will say that we're super residentially driven in the state in general, and that was a sort of a key motivator for us in the approach that we took around working with the energy code. I think that I'm going to give a shout out to RMI's Home Builders Can program as a program that is explicitly looking to support residential scale practitioners in engaging in embodied carbon reduction. And that gives an opportunity for policymakers to at least highlight, spotlight, encourage sort of market-based programming, if not actually use that as a mechanism for some incentives. There's like so much to talk about on the cultural side of things around residential scale and small scale construction that makes like I'm going to belie my own bias here. I think like a partnership and incentive type approaches, particularly when the information is relatively new to the market, can be a really good move prior to going full on with like a regulatory, like compelling practitioners to have to follow certain standards. So I think, there are just so many opportunities in the residential space for making really good improvements and unpacking and revealing a lot of value that's already existent in those building types. Like a lot of these are like light wood frame buildings, like awesome. They've got pretty low carbon intensivity as a building type in the first place. And there's like a whole lot of, there are a lot of material options and like this sort of technical as well as sort of workflow and development opportunities exist in residential construction that I don't, I see more of them there that can be a lot more facile than I see in larger, more complex buildings. So I guess it's not super specific. I guess I'm being a little more general here, but as an overall strategy or approach, I guess the reason I was mentioning the Home Builders Can program is an example of one where it's really working to partner with and support and reveal the value and opportunities that are already there for the residential sector. If for no other reason, it's already relatively underregulated. The structures just aren't necessarily there to just add a requirement onto an existing stack of requirements. And then again, sort of culturally and from a sort of like a power dynamic kind of perspective, we've had a lot more traction in a more collaborative approach built on incentives and opportunities than one that is just trying to leverage another requirement within a regulatory framework.
Great, that's perfect. Thank you so much for those comments on the home builders can and other opportunities. So we are at time. I really want to say thank you to all the panelists for sharing their experiences and their stories. There's a lot of wonderful comments in the chat, that are thanking all of you for sharing these as, examples and models. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Please go to our website, download the report, and go to all the great links and resources that are in there as well. And again, appreciate your time, everyone. Thanks so much.